The storm that brought Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravensholme, to death's door also delivered him into the gentle hands of Imogen Fairfax, a music teacher with secrets of her own. As she tends to his unconscious form at Willowbrook Manor, singing lullabies and sharing her deepest confessions to his still figure, neither realizes that her voice has become his lifeline to sanity. For Sebastian lies trapped in his paralyzed body, fully aware yet unable to respond, falling helplessly in love with the woman who believes him beyond hearing. When her tender care awakens not just his body, but his long-frozen heart, he faces an impossible choice between continuing his deception and losing the only person who has ever truly known his soul. The wind howled across the Yorkshire moors like a banshee's wail, driving sheets of rain against the windows of Lady Pemberton's travelling carriage, with such ferocity that Miss Imogen Fairfax pressed herself deeper into the velvet cushions and pulled her woolen cloak more tightly about her shoulders. The October storm had descended upon them with terrifying suddenness, transforming what should have been a pleasant afternoon journey from Harrogate back to Willowbrook Manor into a harrowing ordeal that tested both horse and human endurance. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could barely make out the familiar landmarks of the countryside, so obscured were they by the tempest's fury, and she found herself offering silent prayers for their safe arrival as the carriage lurched and swayed with each violent gust of wind that seemed determined to lift them from the muddy road entirely. Lady Pemberton, a woman of 60 years whose silver hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure that had somehow remained impeccable despite their trials, sat opposite her with the sort of calm dignity that comes from a lifetime of weathering both literal and metaphorical storms, her pale blue eyes fixed upon the leather-bound book of devotions in her lap, though Imogen suspected her thoughts were far from spiritual matters, given the way her fingers drummed nervously against the cover. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The elderly woman had been unusually quiet during their journey, a marked contrast to her typical animated chatter about the social happenings of their recent visit to her cousin's estate, and Imogen wondered if perhaps the storm had awakened memories of her late husband's tragic death in just such weather 20 years past, a loss that had left her childless and alone, save for the companionship of hired attendants like herself. The thought filled Imogen with a familiar mixture of gratitude and melancholy, for while her position as Lady Pemberton's companion provided her with security and a respectable place in society, it also served as a constant reminder of her own diminished circumstances and the dreams she had been forced to abandon when her father's death left her family penniless and desperate. Thomas, their driver, suddenly pulled the horses to such an abrupt halt that both women were thrown forward against the opposite seats, and Lady Pemberton's book tumbled to the floor as she grasped the leather strap beside her window to steady herself while calling out in alarm. "Good heavens, Thomas, whatever is the matter?" From outside came his gruff voice, barely audible above the storm's roar. "My lady, there's been an accident ahead. A carriage overturned by the looks of it, and someone may be hurt." Lady Pemberton immediately straightened, her expression shifting from concern for her own comfort to the sort of determined compassion that had endeared her to everyone in the district, despite her occasionally sharp tongue. "We must stop at once and render assistance. Thomas, pray see what aid we might provide." Imogen felt her heart begin to race as she peered through the window, straining to see through the curtain of rain that obscured everything beyond a few yards from their carriage. But as Thomas climbed down from his perch and approached the wreckage, she could make out the dark shape of what appeared to be an elegant travelling coach lying on its side like a wounded animal, its once proud wheels spinning uselessly in the air, while the storm continued its relentless assault upon the exposed undercarriage. The sight filled her with dread, for she had witnessed such accidents before, and knew how devastating they could be, particularly in weather like this when help might be hours away and the injured left to the mercy of the elements until rescue could arrive. If indeed it came at all in such a remote location where the nearest village lay several miles distant and the roads were treacherous even in fair weather. Thomas returned within minutes, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his soaked hat, as he leaned down to speak through the partially opened carriage door, while rain dripped steadily from his coat onto the plush interior. "My lady, it's a ducal carriage bearing the Blackwood crest, and there's a gentleman inside who appears to be gravely injured. The driver and footman are dead, God rest their souls, but the passenger yet lives, though barely." Imogen gasped and pressed her hand to her heart, for the name Blackwood was known throughout England as belonging to the Duke of Ravensholme, a man whose reputation for coldness and ruthless business dealings had earned him the sobriquet of the Ice Duke among London society, though she had never seen him herself and knew him only through the whispered tales that followed his name like shadows. Lady Pemberton's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady as she issued her instructions with the authority of one accustomed to command. "Thomas, we must bring him to Willowbrook at once. Have James and Peter assist you in moving the gentleman to our carriage, and mind you are gentle about it, for he may have injuries we cannot see. Then ride ahead to alert Dr. Whitmore and Mrs. Hartwell to prepare the blue guest chamber, and summon whatever assistance they may require. I shall not have it said that a member of the Blackwood family perished for want of proper care, while I had the means to provide it." As Thomas hurried away to carry out her orders, Imogen found herself studying her employer's face with new curiosity, for there had been something in her tone when she spoke the Blackwood name that suggested a familiarity beyond mere social acquaintance, though she dared not inquire about such personal matters given the urgency of their situation. Instead, she busied herself clearing space within their carriage and spreading her own cloak upon the seat to provide what comfort she could for the injured man they were about to receive, all the while wondering what cruel twist of fate had brought the notorious Duke of Ravensholme to such straits on this storm-swept afternoon, when she had expected nothing more eventful than a quiet evening beside the fire at Willowbrook Manor. The men worked with careful efficiency, despite the driving rain that made their task treacherous, and soon they were lifting a tall figure wrapped in Thomas's greatcoat into the carriage, settling him as gently as possible upon the makeshift bed Imogen had prepared, while she pressed herself into the far corner to allow room for his unconscious form. Even in his injured state, there was something unmistakably commanding about Sebastian Blackwood's presence, though whether this impression arose from his imposing height or the aristocratic lines of his face, she could not say, for his features were partially obscured by blood from a wound upon his temple that had already begun to darken with bruising that spoke of the violence of his encounter with fate. His dark hair, usually kept in the precise style favoured by men of fashion, now lay dishevelled across his pale forehead, and his clothing, which bore the unmistakable hallmarks of London's finest tailors, was torn and muddied from the accident. Yet even in this diminished state, he possessed a magnetic quality that seemed to fill the small space of their carriage with an almost tangible tension. Lady Pemberton leaned forward to examine him more closely, her experienced eye taking in the severity of his injuries, while her fingers moved with practiced skill to check for signs of life, and when she looked up her expression was grave, though not without hope. "He lives, though his breathing is shallow, and his pulse weak. We must make haste, for time may be his greatest enemy now, and I fear what damage may have been done within his skull that we cannot see from without." The blue guest chamber at Willowbrook Manor had been transformed into a makeshift hospital within the hour, thanks to the efficient ministrations of Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, and the swift arrival of Dr. Whitmore, a learned gentleman whose reputation for skill had spread throughout the county, despite his preference for treating the common folk, rather than pursuing the more lucrative practice of catering solely to the wealthy families of the district. Imogen stood in the corner of the room, her hands folded before her as she watched the elderly physician conduct his examination of the Duke, with the sort of methodical precision that spoke of decades spent tending to every manner of injury and ailment that could befall the human form, while Lady Pemberton hovered nearby with an anxiety that seemed quite out of character for a woman usually known for her practical composure in times of crisis. The chamber itself, with its pale blue silk hangings and delicate furnishings that reflected Lady Pemberton's refined taste, seemed an oddly gentle setting for such a grim scene. Yet there was something fitting about the way the soft afternoon light that filtered through the tall windows fell across the Duke's still features, lending them an almost ethereal quality that made him appear younger and less formidable than the reputation that had preceded him into their quiet household. Dr. Whitmore straightened slowly from his patient's bedside, his grey whiskers quivering slightly as he shook his head with the sort of measured gravity that physicians employ when delivering news that offers little comfort to anxious relatives. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of professional experience, tempered by genuine concern for the human suffering he had witnessed throughout his long career. "I have done what I can for the immediate injuries, Lady Pemberton, but I must be frank with you about his condition, for it is indeed grave. The blow to his head has caused significant trauma, and while there are no obvious fractures to the skull that I can detect, the swelling within may yet prove dangerous, and I cannot predict when, or indeed if, he will regain consciousness. His other injuries, though painful, are not life-threatening in themselves, but this head wound concerns me greatly, for such damage can affect a man in ways we do not fully understand, and I have seen patients who appeared to recover completely, only to succumb days or even weeks later to complications we never anticipated." Lady Pemberton's face had grown even paler during this recitation, but she maintained her composure with visible effort as she pressed for more specific information that might guide their care of the injured Duke. "What must we do, Dr. Whitmore, to give him the best chance of recovery? And what signs should we watch for that might indicate a change in his condition, for better or worse?" The physician adjusted his spectacles and glanced once more at his patient before responding with the sort of careful consideration that had made him trusted by families throughout the region, despite his unconventional methods and his habit of speaking plainly rather than offering false reassurances that might provide temporary comfort at the expense of honest preparation for what lay ahead. He must be kept warm and still, with someone in constant attendance to monitor his breathing and watch for any signs of fever or convulsion that might indicate the pressure within his skull is increasing beyond what his body can tolerate. The wounds must be kept clean and dressed daily, though I suspect they will heal well enough given time and proper care, but it is his mind that concerns me most, for even should he wake, there is no predicting what faculties he may retain or what memories may be lost to him forever. I have known men to recover from such injuries with no lasting effects, save perhaps an occasional headache, while others have awakened to find themselves changed in ways both subtle and profound, their very personalities altered by damage we cannot see or measure except in its effects upon their behavior and capacity for reason. Lady Pemberton nodded gravely as she absorbed this information, then turned to Imogen with a request that would alter the course of both their lives in ways neither could yet foresee. "My dear, I know this is an extraordinary burden to place upon you, but I wonder if you might consent to serve as his primary attendant during this difficult time, for you possess both the gentle nature and the musical abilities that Dr. Whitmore believes might prove beneficial in such cases, where the unconscious mind may yet respond to stimuli that reach beyond our current understanding of how the brain functions in times of trauma." Imogen felt her breath catch in her throat at this unexpected responsibility, for while she had assisted with minor ailments and injuries among the household staff, she had never been entrusted with the care of someone so gravely hurt, particularly someone of such elevated rank, whose recovery or decline might have consequences reaching far beyond the walls of Willowbrook Manor. Yet something in Lady Pemberton's expression, a mixture of trust and desperate hope, made refusal impossible, and she found herself nodding agreement even as her mind raced with questions about her qualifications for such a task and the propriety of an unmarried woman tending to an unconscious gentleman, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Dr. Whitmore smiled approvingly at her acceptance, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he offered what encouragement he could. "Miss Fairfax, I have observed your caring nature during my visits to this household, and I believe the Duke could not be in better hands, for healing is as much about the spirit as the body, and there is something in your disposition that speaks of the sort of peace that may reach him even in his current state. I suggest you read to him daily, speak of pleasant things, and perhaps sing those melodies I have heard you practice, for music has been known to stir the mind when all else fails, and we must try every means at our disposal to call him back from whatever dark place his consciousness now wanders." As the physician gathered his instruments and prepared to depart, with promises to return the following morning, Imogen found herself alone with the Duke for the first time, and the weight of her new responsibility settled upon her shoulders like a mantle she was not certain she was worthy to wear. She moved quietly to the bedside and gazed down at the pale, still features that showed no sign of the formidable intelligence and ruthless determination for which Sebastian Blackwood had become infamous throughout England, seeing instead only a man brought low by forces beyond his control and dependent upon strangers for his very survival. The irony was not lost upon her that the same storm which had inconvenienced her modest journey had potentially altered the fate of one of the most powerful men in the realm, reducing him to a state of helplessness that made her own humble circumstances seem almost enviable by comparison. Yet as she settled into the chair that would become her constant post over the days to come, she felt not triumph at his fall, but a curious mixture of compassion and determination to prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in her hands. The third morning after the Duke's arrival dawned grey and subdued, with autumn mist clinging to the gardens of Willowbrook Manor like a shroud that seemed to mirror the sombre atmosphere that had settled over the household since their unexpected patient had taken residence in the blue guest chamber. Imogen sat in her customary chair beside the bed, a leather-bound volume of poetry resting unopened in her lap as she studied the Duke's pale features in the wan light that filtered through the tall windows, searching for any sign of change that might indicate an improvement in his condition, or perhaps the onset of the fever that Dr. Whitmore had warned them to watch for with such grave concern. 3 days had passed without the slightest alteration in his breathing or posture, and she found herself beginning to understand why the good doctor had spoken so cautiously about the prospects for recovery. For there was something almost death-like in the Duke's stillness that made her wonder if his spirit had perhaps already departed this earthly realm, leaving behind only the shell of what had once been one of England's most powerful men. Yet something in the set of his features, even in unconsciousness, suggested a strength that had not yet been vanquished, and she clung to this impression as she began her daily ritual of reading aloud, though today she found herself departing from the usual selections of poetry and essays to speak instead of more personal matters, as though the intimacy of their peculiar situation had gradually worn away the barriers of propriety that would normally prevent such confidences. "Your Grace," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she set aside the book and folded her hands in her lap. "I find myself wondering if you can hear me in whatever distant place your mind now dwells, and whether you might find some comfort in knowing that you are not alone in your suffering. For there are those among us who understand what it means to have one's life altered by circumstances beyond our control. I suppose it would be presumptuous of me to compare my modest trials to whatever battles you may be fighting in the darkness that has claimed you, but perhaps there is some common ground between us that I had not previously considered, some shared experience of loss that might bridge the vast gulf that separates our stations in life. She paused, gathering courage for the confession that had been building within her heart over these days of silent companionship, then continued with growing confidence as the words began to flow more freely. You see, Your Grace, I was not always destined for the life of a companion, grateful though I am for Lady Pemberton's kindness in providing me with respectable employment and a secure place in society. There was a time, not so many years ago, when I harbored dreams that now seem almost laughable in their ambition, when I believed that my modest talents might carry me beyond the narrow confines of my birth and station to something approaching the recognition that my dear father always insisted I deserved, though his faith in my abilities may have been colored by the natural partiality of a loving parent. My father, Edmund Fairfax, was a music master of some renown in his day, though his reputation was built more upon the excellence of his teaching and the depth of his musical understanding than upon any great fortune he managed to accumulate during his career, for he possessed that peculiar combination of artistic genius and practical incompetence that seems to afflict so many men of creative temperament. He taught the daughters of the gentry to play the pianoforte and sing with proper technique, and his pupils were much sought after by the finest families in the county, yet somehow he never managed to translate this success into the sort of financial security that might have protected his own family when age and illness began to take their toll upon his ability to work. Her voice grew softer as she continued, the memories flooding back with a vividness that surprised her after all these years of carefully suppressing them in favor of accepting her reduced circumstances with as much grace as she could muster. He used to say that music was the language of the soul, Your Grace, and that those who could truly master it possessed a gift that transcended the petty concerns of social rank and material wealth. For a beautiful melody could move the heart of a duke as surely as that of a shepherd, and in that moment of shared emotion, all artificial barriers would fall away, leaving only the pure communion of spirit that he believed was the highest achievement of human existence. I fear I inherited both his love of music and his tendency toward impractical idealism, though life has taught me to temper the latter with a healthy dose of realism that he never quite managed to acquire, even when poverty began to threaten our very survival. When I was 18, he had arranged for me to audition for a position with a touring company that performed for the finest houses throughout England, and the maestro who heard me play spoke of my potential in terms that made my father weep with pride and convinced me that I might indeed escape the fate that seemed to await most young women of modest means. But fate, as you well know, Your Grace, is often cruel in its timing, for my father fell gravely ill just weeks before I was to depart, and by the time he passed into the arms of his Creator, our small savings had been exhausted by medical expenses and the funeral costs that dignity demanded, leaving my younger sister, Arabella, and myself quite destitute and dependent upon the charity of relatives who made their reluctant assistance contingent upon our acceptance of whatever arrangements they deemed suitable for young women in our reduced circumstances. Arabella, bless her gentle heart, possessed the sort of ethereal beauty that men find irresistible, with golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, and blue eyes that seemed to hold all the innocence and sweetness that poets celebrate in their verses about ideal feminine beauty. And it was not long before she attracted the attention of Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, a curate of modest means but excellent character, who offered her the security of marriage and the respectability of his name, though their union meant separation from the only family she had ever known and removal to a distant parish where his duties called him to serve among the poor and forgotten. I encouraged the match, of course, for what other choice did we have? And I could not bear the thought of her beauty fading in poverty when she might instead find happiness as the wife of a good man who cherished her above all earthly possessions. Yet I confess that watching her drive away in Mr. Hartwell's modest cart, her few belongings packed in a single trunk, and her face bright with the hope that young love brings to even the most uncertain future, I felt as though I were witnessing the death of my own dreams, as surely as if they had been buried in the churchyard beside my dear father. She paused to wipe away a tear that had escaped her careful composure, then continued with the part of her story that she had never shared with another living soul, the secret shame that had driven her to accept the limitations of her current position with something approaching gratitude. That same week, I received word that the touring company was still interested in my services, for the maestro remembered my audition and believed that with proper training I might develop into a performer of genuine distinction, capable of commanding audiences in the finest concert halls of London, and perhaps even on the continent, where the appreciation for musical excellence is said to exceed even our own considerable standards. The offer was more generous than I had dared hope, with provisions for lodging and instruction that would have allowed me to pursue my artistic development without the constant worry about survival that had plagued our household during my father's final illness. Yet accepting it would have meant abandoning Arabella to face an uncertain future alone, and I could not bring myself to pursue my own happiness at such a cost to the sister who had always looked to me for protection and guidance. Instead, I wrote a careful letter declining their offer with expressions of gratitude and regret that seemed inadequate to convey the magnitude of what I was surrendering, then set about finding respectable employment that would allow me to maintain my dignity while earning enough to supplement the modest portion that distant relatives grudgingly provided for my maintenance. Lady Pemberton's advertisement for a companion and music teacher seemed like a godsend, offering not only security but the opportunity to continue working with the art that had been my father's greatest gift to me, even if only in the limited capacity of instructing young ladies in the accomplishments that society deemed essential for their proper development. Yet even now, Your Grace, when I sit at the pianoforte in Lady Pemberton's music room and play the pieces that my father taught me with such love and patience, I find myself composing melodies that spring from some deep well within my heart, fragments of the music I might have shared with the world had circumstances been different, and though I dare not play them for others, I sometimes imagine what it would be like to hear them performed by skilled musicians in a concert hall filled with people who understood their meaning and felt their power to touch the human spirit in ways that words alone could never achieve. She reached into the small reticule that hung from her wrist and withdrew a folded piece of paper, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed it against her skirt, and prepared to share something that had never been intended for any ears but her own. I have written down one such melody, Your Grace, though I know it is presumptuous of me to imagine that you would find any merit in the humble offerings of an obscure music teacher, yet there is something about your current circumstances that makes me bold enough to share it, for if you cannot hear me, then my secret remains safe. And if you can, then perhaps my small gift might provide some comfort in whatever darkness currently surrounds your consciousness. What Sebastian Blackwood experienced in that moment was a revelation so profound that it seemed to illuminate corners of his soul that had remained shrouded in darkness since his 12th year, when his mother's death had extinguished the last source of warmth and tenderness in his carefully ordered world, and left him at the mercy of a father whose idea of proper education involved the systematic crushing of any emotion that might be construed as weakness or sentiment. He had regained consciousness 3 days earlier, on the morning after his arrival at Willowbrook Manor, awakening not to the familiar surroundings of his own chambers at Ravensholme, but to the gentle blue and cream decorations of an unfamiliar room and the soft sound of an unknown woman's voice reading poetry with a musical cadence that seemed to wrap itself around his battered spirit like a healing balm. Yet when he had attempted to open his eyes or move his limbs, he had discovered to his mounting horror that his body remained as unresponsive as a corpse, trapped in a paralysis that Dr. Whitmore's limited understanding had failed to properly diagnose or explain. The initial fury that had consumed him at this discovery of his helplessness had been so intense that he had feared it might literally burst the blood vessels in his brain and finish the work that the carriage accident had begun. For Sebastian Blackwood was not a man accustomed to depending upon others for his survival, having learned early in life that vulnerability was a luxury he could not afford if he hoped to preserve what remained of his sanity and self-respect after his father's systematic efforts to remake him in his own cold, calculating image. He had spent the first day of his conscious imprisonment plotting the dismissal of everyone involved in his care once he recovered the use of his faculties, planning the sort of thorough retribution that had made his enemies fear to cross him in business or society. Yet as Imogen's voice continued its gentle ministrations, reading to him of poetry and beauty and human kindness, with a sincerity that seemed utterly foreign to his experience of the world, something within him had begun to shift and soften in ways that he had thought permanently calcified by years of disappointment and betrayal. Her revelations about her past struck him with unexpected force, for here was a woman who had sacrificed everything for love and duty without a trace of the bitterness or resentment that he had come to expect from those who had suffered life's cruel reversals. And as she spoke of her lost dreams and surrendered ambitions with such gentle acceptance of her fate, he found himself experiencing emotions that he had buried so deeply he had forgotten they existed. Chief among them, a compassion for another's suffering that seemed to crack the ice around his heart like the first warm rays of spring sunlight penetrating a frozen lake. The melody she hummed as she smoothed the paper containing her composition was like nothing he had ever heard, yet it stirred memories so distant and precious that he had convinced himself they were merely the fantasies of a lonely child's imagination. Memories of his mother sitting at the pianoforte in the music room at Ravensholme, her gentle hands coaxing similar haunting melodies from the keys while she sang in a voice that had been the only source of beauty and love in his young life, until consumption had stolen her away and left him alone with a father who seemed to blame him personally for her loss. The realization that this unknown woman possessed not only a musical gift that rivaled his mother's, but also a capacity for selfless love that his mother would have recognized and cherished, filled him with a longing so intense that it was almost painful. A desire not merely for physical recovery, but for the sort of spiritual healing that he had never dared imagine might be possible for someone as damaged as he had become through years of careful cultivation of emotional emptiness. As he listened to her speak of her sister's marriage and her own surrender of musical ambitions, he became aware of other sounds filtering into the room from beyond its walls, the hushed conversations of servants discussing his condition with the sort of morbid fascination that the powerful inspire when brought low by fate. And more disturbing still, the arrival of his cousin Rupert, whose voice carried clearly through the thin walls as he spoke with Lady Pemberton about the practical arrangements that would need to be made if the Duke's condition proved permanent or fatal. That scheming wastrel was already circling like a vulture, calculating the inheritance that would fall to him as the next male heir if Sebastian failed to recover, and the Duke's helpless fury at his inability to expose his cousin's barely concealed greed was tempered only by his growing fascination with the woman who continued her gentle vigil beside his bed, reading to him and speaking to him as though he were a cherished friend rather than the cold, forbidding figure that society had learned to approach with careful deference and barely concealed fear. Her music, when she finally began to play the melody she had composed, transported him back to those distant afternoons when his mother's playing had been the only respite from his father's harsh criticism and impossible demands, and he found himself wondering if this remarkable woman might possess the key not only to his physical recovery, but to the restoration of the humanity that he had thought permanently lost in his transformation from vulnerable child to the ruthless Duke of Ravensholme. The 4th week of the Duke's residence at Willowbrook Manor brought with it the first hints of winter's approach, as the last stubborn leaves clung to the bare branches of the oak trees that lined the drive, and the morning air carried a sharp bite that promised frost before the week's end. Imogen had fallen into a comfortable routine with her patient, arriving each morning after breaking her fast to find the blue guest chamber filled with the pale golden light that filtered through windows she now opened daily to provide fresh air that Dr. Whitmore had proclaimed essential for recovery, though the good doctor's weekly visits had begun to carry an air of diminishing hope that even his professional optimism could not entirely disguise. The Duke's condition remained unchanged in all observable particulars, yet Imogen had begun to fancy that there was something different in the quality of his stillness, a sense that beneath the marble-like composure of his features, some vital force continued to burn with undiminished intensity, waiting for the proper moment to reclaim dominion over the flesh that currently imprisoned it. She no longer felt the awkwardness that had initially made her monologues stilted and self-conscious, for the intimacy of their unusual relationship had gradually worn away the barriers of rank and propriety that might otherwise have prevented such confidences, and she found herself speaking to him with the sort of natural ease that she had never experienced even with her closest friends, as though his enforced silence had created a sanctuary where her deepest thoughts could be expressed without fear of judgment or rejection. This morning, as she settled into her customary chair and arranged the shawl Lady Pemberton had provided against the increasing chill, she found herself compelled to share the sort of personal revelation that would have seemed impossible during those first tentative days when she had confined herself to reading aloud from books of poetry and essays on improving subjects that seemed suitably impersonal for their strange circumstances. "Your Grace," she began, her voice carrying the soft musical quality that had become as familiar to Sebastian as his own heartbeat. "I find myself wondering if you have ever experienced that peculiar form of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who see only what they expect to see, rather than who you truly are, beneath the roles that society has assigned you to play. I suspect that a man of your elevated position might understand such feelings even better than I, for surely the weight of a dukedom must sometimes feel like a mask that obscures the man beneath, just as my position as a companion often seems to render me invisible, except when my services are required for some specific purpose." She paused to arrange the flowers that Lady Pemberton had cut from the conservatory, their delicate perfume adding a touch of beauty to the room that seemed somehow appropriate for the confessions that were about to unfold like petals opening to the morning sun. "I have been thinking a great deal lately about the nature of love, Your Grace, and whether it is possible for someone in my circumstances ever to inspire the sort of deep affection that poets celebrate in their verses about hearts that beat as one and souls that recognize their perfect complement in another. You see, I fear that whatever modest attractions I may possess are so thoroughly overshadowed by my usefulness as a teacher and companion that any gentleman who might notice me would be more interested in acquiring my services than in winning my heart. And the thought of being valued primarily for what I can provide, rather than for who I am, fills me with a sadness that I cannot entirely banish, no matter how sternly I remind myself that such romantic notions are luxuries that women in my position can ill afford to entertain. Her voice grew softer as she continued, the words flowing with the sort of honesty that only solitude or the presence of someone who cannot respond can inspire, and she found herself sharing thoughts that had never before been spoken aloud, not even in the privacy of her own chambers when sleep eluded her, and she lay staring at the ceiling while contemplating the narrow possibilities that life seemed to offer someone of her limited means and unconventional situation. I sometimes wonder if my dear sister Arabella experiences true happiness in her marriage to Mr. Hartwell, or if she too feels the weight of gratitude that must be expressed daily for a security purchased at the cost of romantic dreams. For though he is undoubtedly a good man who treats her with kindness and respect, I cannot forget the way her eyes used to light up when she spoke of the heroes in the novels she loved to read, men of passion and poetry who swept their beloveds into adventures that transcended the mundane concerns of household management and parish duties. I encouraged her match because it seemed the sensible course, yet I carry a burden of guilt for the way I may have influenced her toward practicality, when her heart might have chosen differently if given the luxury of choice rather than the necessity of survival. And I wonder if she ever resents the sacrifice I made in declining my musical opportunity, for perhaps she would have preferred to face uncertainty with me rather than accept the safety of a marriage that secured her future, but may have cost her the chance for the sort of love that transforms ordinary existence into something approaching magic. The confession that followed seemed to surprise even Imogen herself, for she had guarded this particular secret so carefully that she had almost convinced herself it was merely the product of idle fancy rather than a serious artistic endeavor that had occupied her thoughts and filled her spare moments with a creative satisfaction she had never experienced before. I have been working on a musical composition, Your Grace, a piano sonata that I have never dared to play for another living soul, for it contains emotions and longings that I fear would reveal too much about the woman beneath the composed exterior that I have cultivated for the benefit of those who employ me, and depend upon my discretion in all matters both personal and professional. The piece is dedicated to lost love, though I confess with some embarrassment that I have never actually experienced such love myself, having drawn my inspiration instead from the novels and poetry that have provided my only glimpse into the sort of passion that poets claim can elevate the human spirit to heights of ecstasy and depths of despair that make ordinary existence seem pale and insignificant by comparison. Perhaps it is presumptuous of me to attempt to capture in music emotions I have never felt firsthand, yet something within me insists that the heart can understand and express truths that the mind has never directly encountered. And when I sit at Lady Pemberton's pianoforte in the evening after my duties are complete and allow my fingers to find their way across the keys, I sometimes feel as though I am channeling the dreams and desires of all the women who have loved and lost throughout history, giving voice to their joys and sorrows through melodies that seem to spring from some source deeper than my own limited experience could provide. The changing seasons outside his window had become a source of profound meditation for Sebastian, as he watched through Imogen's loving descriptions the transformation of the landscape from autumn's golden abundance to winter's stark beauty, each detail rendered with the sort of poetic sensibility that revealed her artistic nature even in the most casual observations about the weather or the activities of the local wildlife that had taken up residence in the gardens of Willowbrook Manor. Her daily readings of correspondence had provided him with a fascinating glimpse into the way his accident was being perceived by London society, and he was both amused and touched by her careful editing of the letters that arrived with increasing frequency as word of his condition spread throughout England, for she had appointed herself his guardian against the sort of cruel speculation and ghoulish curiosity that always surrounded the misfortunes of the powerful, reading aloud only the messages that expressed genuine concern for his welfare, while tactfully omitting the more salacious gossip that inevitably accompanied such dramatic reversals of fortune. Through her selective sharing of local news and village gossip, he had gained an appreciation for the rhythms of rural life that his previous existence had never afforded him the opportunity to observe, and he found himself oddly fascinated by her accounts of the blacksmith's courtship of the baker's daughter, the vicar's ongoing battle with the church roof that leaked abominably during heavy rains, and the various domestic dramas that provided endless entertainment for the residents of the small community that surrounded Willowbrook Manor. Her fierce loyalty to Lady Pemberton was evident in every word she spoke about her employer, and Sebastian found himself developing a genuine affection for the elderly woman who had taken him in without question and provided him with care that went far beyond the obligations of distant kinship, even as he began to understand through Imogen's casual references to their daily routines that his presence had disrupted the peaceful household in ways that neither woman complained about, but which had undoubtedly imposed significant burdens on their resources and time. Most profoundly moving of all was her protective instinct toward him, which manifested itself in small gestures and careful considerations that revealed a depth of caring that he had never encountered in all his years of commanding the deference of servants and the calculated attentions of those who sought his favor for their own purposes. For here was someone who watched over him not because duty or ambition demanded it, but simply because her compassionate nature could not bear to see another creature suffer alone and undefended. The gradual deepening of his feelings for this remarkable woman had caught him completely unprepared, for he had never believed himself capable of the sort of tender emotion that poets celebrated and that he had dismissed as romantic nonsense designed to make ordinary people feel better about the limitations and disappointments that characterized most human relationships. Yet as he listened day after day to her gentle voice and witnessed through her words the beauty of a spirit that remained undimmed by hardship and sacrifice, he found himself experiencing a transformation that seemed to touch every aspect of his understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. Her confession about her composition dedicated to lost love had moved him almost to tears, for the irony of her situation seemed to mirror his own in ways that were both heartbreaking and strangely hopeful, as though fate had conspired to bring together two souls who had given up on the possibility of finding the sort of connection that transcended the mundane concerns of daily existence and opened doorways to experiences that neither had believed possible within the confines of their respective circumstances and obligations. The knowledge that she had created something beautiful from her own unfulfilled longings made him yearn not only for physical recovery, but for the chance to hear her music played with all the skill and passion that he sensed lay hidden beneath her modest demeanor, and he began to dream of a future that included not only his return to health, but the opportunity to provide her with the artistic opportunities that circumstances had forced her to abandon, though he dared not yet allow himself to imagine what form such assistance might take, or whether she would be willing to accept help from someone whose reputation for coldness and calculation preceded him into every room he entered. The arrival of Rupert Blackwood on a grey morning in late November brought with it an atmosphere of barely concealed avarice and calculated concern that seemed to pollute the very air of Willowbrook Manor, as Sebastian's cousin swept into the blue guest chamber with the sort of theatrical displays of grief and anxiety that might have convinced a casual observer of his genuine distress, but which fooled no one who possessed even modest powers of observation or any experience with the ways in which unscrupulous relatives behave when significant inheritances hang in the balance. Rupert was a man of 40 years whose dissipated lifestyle had left its mark in the soft flesh around his waist and the network of fine lines that surrounded his pale blue eyes, which possessed none of the intelligence or strength that had made Sebastian such a formidable figure in business and society, and his attempts to project an air of ducal authority were undermined by the nervous energy that seemed to animate his every gesture and the calculating glances he directed toward everything in the room that might have monetary value. "My dear cousin," he began with elaborate ceremony as he approached the bedside where Sebastian lay in helpless fury, unable to express his revulsion at this unwelcome intrusion into the sanctuary that Imogen's presence had created. "How grieved I am to see you reduced to such straits, though I confess I am somewhat encouraged by the excellent care you appear to be receiving in this charming establishment, for Lady Pemberton has clearly spared no expense in providing for your comfort during this trying ordeal." His voice carried the sort of false sincerity that Sebastian had learned to recognize and despise during his years of navigating the treacherous waters of London society, where men like Rupert flourished by preying upon the misfortunes of others while maintaining a facade of respectability that fooled only those who wished to be deceived. "Dr. Whitmore has been most forthcoming about your condition, dear Sebastian, and while we must all hope for the best possible outcome, I fear we must also prepare ourselves for the possibility that your recovery may not be as complete as we might wish, or indeed that the damage to your faculties may prove permanent in ways that would make it necessary to consider alternative arrangements for your care and the management of your affairs." The barely concealed eagerness with which he spoke these words made Sebastian's blood boil with a rage so intense that it seemed to burn through his paralyzed nervous system like acid. Yet he remained as motionless as a statue, while his cousin continued his performance of concerned kinship, with the sort of practiced ease that suggested he had rehearsed this scene many times before arriving at Willowbrook Manor. "It pains me to speak of such practical matters when you lie here fighting for your very life," Rupert continued with a theatrical sigh that fooled no one present, "but as your closest male relative, and the heir to the dukedom should God choose to call you to your eternal rest, I feel it is my duty to ensure that proper provisions are made for your continued care in an institution better equipped to deal with cases such as yours, where the mind has been damaged beyond the point where ordinary nursing can provide adequate assistance." Lady Pemberton's face had grown increasingly pale during this recitation, and when she finally found her voice to respond, it carried the sort of controlled anger that only a woman of her breeding and experience could muster in the face of such transparent greed disguised as familial concern. "Mr. Blackwood, I fear you may be somewhat premature in your assessments, for Dr. Whitmore has expressed cautious optimism about His Grace's eventual recovery, and while progress may be slower than we might wish, there have been subtle signs of improvement that suggest his condition is far from hopeless." Rupert's response to this gentle rebuke revealed the true nature of his character, for his mask of concern slipped just enough to reveal the calculating opportunist beneath, as he dismissed Lady Pemberton's observations with a wave of his hand that bordered on insulting. "My dear madam, while I appreciate your optimism and the kindness you have shown my unfortunate cousin, I fear that your natural compassion may be clouding your judgment regarding the severity of his condition, for it has been nearly a month since the accident with no meaningful improvement, and the expense of his continued care must surely be placing a tremendous burden upon your household finances, particularly given the specialized attention that such cases require." It was at this moment that Imogen, who had been quietly arranging flowers in a corner of the room, stepped forward with a courage that surprised even herself, her normally gentle demeanor transformed by an indignation that made her eyes flash with unusual fire as she prepared to defend her patient against this transparent attempt to remove him from the only place where he was receiving proper care and genuine affection. "Mr. Blackwood," she said with a composure that belied the anger burning within her heart, "I fear you may be mistaken in your assessment of His Grace's condition, for those of us who attend him daily have observed signs of awareness that might not be apparent to a casual visitor, and while his recovery may indeed require patience and continued care, there is every reason to hope that time will restore him to full health if he is allowed to remain in surroundings where he feels secure and valued, rather than being subjected to the sort of institutional care that treats patients as problems to be managed rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Dr. Whitmore's suggestion came during his weekly visit in early December. As frost painted delicate patterns on the windows of the blue guest chamber, and the winter light that filtered through the glass seemed pale and distant, compared to the warm glow of the fire that crackled in the hearth. Lady Pemberton had ordered, kept burning throughout the day for the Duke's comfort. The elderly physician had completed his examination with the same methodical care that had characterized his previous visits. Yet there was something different in his manner as he straightened from the bedside and turned to address Imogen with an expression that suggested he had been pondering a new course of treatment during the long hours since his last assessment of their patient's unchanged condition. "Miss Fairfax," he began, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he paced to the window and gazed out at the snow-laden gardens that stretched toward the distant moors. "I have been considering alternative approaches to His Grace's treatment, for while his physical injuries appear to be healing satisfactorily, the persistence of his unconscious state suggests that we may need to explore methods that address the mind and spirit rather than merely the body." He turned back to face her with the sort of earnest attention that had made him beloved by patients throughout the county, despite his unconventional theories about the connection between emotional well-being and physical health. "You mentioned during our previous conversations that you possess considerable musical training, and I wonder if you might be willing to attempt a form of therapy that has shown promising results in similar cases, though I must confess the scientific basis for such treatment remains largely theoretical and relies more upon observation than upon any established medical doctrine. The idea of music as a healing force is not entirely foreign to those of us who have devoted our lives to understanding the mysteries of human consciousness, for we have long observed that certain patients respond to auditory stimuli even when they appear completely unaware of their surroundings, and there have been documented cases where familiar melodies have seemed to penetrate barriers that conventional medicine could not breach. Imogen felt her heart quicken at this suggestion, for while she had sung softly to the Duke during their quiet hours together, the prospect of playing actual compositions for him opened possibilities that seemed almost too wonderful to contemplate, particularly given her growing conviction that something within him remained aware and responsive despite the evidence of his senses that suggested otherwise. "Dr. Whitmore," she replied with barely contained enthusiasm, "I should be honored to attempt such treatment, for I have long believed that music possesses qualities that transcend our ordinary understanding of how the human spirit can be touched and moved by beauty. And if there is any chance that my modest abilities might contribute to His Grace's recovery, then I shall gladly devote whatever time and effort may be required." Lady Pemberton, who had been listening to this exchange with the sort of thoughtful attention that characterized her approach to all matters concerning their patient's welfare, nodded her approval with a warmth that spoke of her own hope that this new approach might succeed where conventional treatments had failed. "My dear, you shall have access to the music room whenever you require it, and I shall have the staff move the Duke's bed to the chamber adjacent to it, so that he may benefit from your playing without the strain of being transported, for I have noticed myself that he seems more peaceful when you sing to him, though I had not considered that formal musical performance might provide even greater therapeutic benefits." The music room at Willowbrook Manor was a testament to Lady Pemberton's refined taste and her appreciation for the arts, with its delicate French furnishings arranged around a magnificent pianoforte whose glossy ebony surface reflected the winter light that streamed through tall windows draped in silk the color of morning mist. Imogen had always found comfort in this elegant space during the evening hours when her duties were complete, and Lady Pemberton encouraged her to practice for her own enjoyment. Yet, as she seated herself at the instrument on this December afternoon with Sebastian, positioned nearby in the specially arranged bed that allowed him to face the piano, she felt a nervousness that had nothing to do with her technical abilities, and everything to do with the hope that her music might somehow reach across the mysterious divide that separated his conscious mind from the world around him. She began with Mozart's Piano Sonata in a major, allowing the crystalline clarity of the classical structure to fill the room with sounds that seemed to dance through the air like visible beauty, and as her fingers found their familiar patterns across the keys, she glanced frequently toward Sebastian's still form, searching for any sign that the music was penetrating whatever barriers held his consciousness prisoner within his motionless body. The Mozart was followed by a Beethoven sonata that she had learned from her father during the golden days when her musical future had seemed unlimited and full of promise. And as the passionate intensity of the romantic composition swelled through the room, she found herself pouring into the performance all the emotions that had accumulated during these weeks of caring for a man who had become far more than a patient, though she dared not examine too closely the nature of the feelings that his presence had awakened within her carefully guarded heart. Yet it was when she began to play her own compositions that the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift in ways that were subtle but unmistakable, as though the melodies that sprang from her own creative spirit possessed a quality that the masterworks of famous composers could not provide, perhaps because they carried within them something of her own essence that resonated with frequencies that formal musical education could not teach or technique alone could not convey. The first piece she had written during those lonely evenings at Willowbrook, when the wind howled across the moors, and she found herself thinking about dreams deferred and loves that existed only in imagination, and as the haunting melody flowed from her fingers with the sort of natural grace that comes when technical skill merges seamlessly with genuine emotion, she became aware that Sebastian's breathing had altered in ways that were almost imperceptible but definitely present to someone who had spent countless hours monitoring the rhythm of his respiration. The change was so slight that she might have dismissed it as wishful thinking. Yet as she continued playing and moved into the second movement of her sonata, the variations in his breathing became more pronounced, following the rise and fall of the musical phrases with a consistency could not be attributed to coincidence or the power of suggestion. Most remarkable of all was his response to a particular melody that she had composed during a sleepless night, when memories of her father had filled her thoughts with bittersweet recollections of the lullabies he used to hum while working on his own musical arrangements. A simple tune that had seemed to emerge from some deep wellspring of memory and emotion that connected her to all the generations of mothers and fathers who had sung their children to sleep with melodies passed down through countless years of human tenderness. As the familiar notes filled the room, Sebastian's features seemed to soften in ways that were barely visible but unmistakably real, and for a moment Imogen could have sworn that she saw the faintest movement of his lips, as though he were attempting to hum along with the melody that had touched something profound within his consciousness. What Imogen could not know was that her innocent lullaby bore a striking resemblance to the one melody from Sebastian's childhood that had survived the systematic destruction of all tender emotions that his father had considered necessary for the proper education of a future duke, a simple tune that his mother used to sing during the brief periods when illness confined her to her chambers, and she was free from the watchful eyes of a husband who disapproved of what he called sentimental weaknesses that would only serve to make their son unfit for the harsh realities of leadership and power. The Duchess of Ravensholme had been a woman of gentle spirit and artistic sensibilities, who had married Sebastian's father during a time when he was still capable of kindness, and who had watched with growing despair as the responsibilities of his position and the influence of advisers who valued strength above compassion gradually transformed the man she had loved into someone she barely recognized, though she had never ceased trying to protect her son from the worst effects of his father's increasingly rigid expectations and harsh disciplinary methods. During Sebastian's early childhood, before consumption began its slow work of destroying her fragile health, she had been his refuge from a world that seemed determined to crush any sign of softness or vulnerability, and her lullabies had been the one consistent source of comfort in a household where affection was considered a dangerous indulgence that might undermine the sort of character necessary for commanding respect and maintaining authority over lesser mortals. The melody that now flowed from Imogen's fingers carried within it echoes of those precious moments when his mother's voice had been the only barrier between his frightened child's heart and the cold reality of his father's expectations, and as the familiar patterns of notes awakened memories that had been buried beneath decades of careful emotional control, Sebastian felt something within his paralyzed body begin to respond in ways that transcended the purely physical limitations that had held him prisoner since the accident. The lullaby triggered not only memories, but neurological pathways that connected his consciousness to motor functions in ways that even Dr. Whitmore's limited understanding of such matters could not have predicted, and for the first time since awakening to find himself trapped within his unresponsive flesh, Sebastian felt the faintest stirring of sensation in his fingertips, as though the music were somehow rebuilding the bridges between his mind and his body that trauma had severed. The experience was both exhilarating and terrifying, for it suggested that recovery might indeed be possible, while simultaneously reminding him of how much he had lost and how uncertain his future remained. Yet the hope that Imogen's music had awakened within him seemed to burn with an intensity that made all other considerations pale in comparison to the possibility that he might someday be able to respond to her gentle care with something more than the helpless gratitude that currently consumed his thoughts. Her dedication to his welfare had become the central organizing principle of his existence during these weeks of enforced passivity, and the knowledge that her music was reaching him in ways that conventional treatment could not provided him with the first real evidence that the connection he felt between them might be based upon something more substantial than the one-sided affection of a helpless man for the woman who had become his lifeline to sanity and hope. Lady Pemberton's revelation came during one of those quiet December evenings when the duties of the household were complete, and she had invited Imogen to join her in the small sitting room that served as her private retreat from the formal spaces where she received visitors and conducted the business of managing her estate. The elderly woman had seemed unusually contemplative throughout dinner, and as they settled before the fire with their embroidery and books, there was something in her manner that suggested she had been wrestling with thoughts that required careful consideration before being shared with another person. "My dear," she began as she set aside her needlework and fixed Imogen with the sort of steady gaze that indicated she was about to speak of matters close to her heart, "I fear I have not been entirely forthcoming with you about my reasons for insisting that we care for His Grace here at Willowbrook, rather than allowing him to be moved to one of those institutions that his cousin has been advocating with such unseemly persistence." Her voice carried a tremor that spoke of emotions long suppressed, and Imogen found herself setting aside her own work as she sensed that whatever confession was about to unfold would require her complete attention, and perhaps her understanding of circumstances that had shaped Lady Pemberton's life in ways that polite society would never acknowledge or discuss. "The truth is that my connection to the Blackwood family extends far beyond the distant kinship that I have claimed as justification for our involvement in Sebastian's care, for there was a time, many years ago, when I harbored feelings for his father that went well beyond the sort of casual affection that might exist between friends of neighboring families. Lady Pemberton's admission hung in the air between them like a delicate piece of crystal that might shatter if subjected to sudden movement or harsh examination. And Imogen felt her own breath catch as she began to understand the deeper currents that had guided her employer's decisions regarding the Duke's treatment and recovery. "I was 18 when I first met the elder Duke," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she committed herself to the full revelation of secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. "And he was perhaps 25, already bearing the responsibilities of his title, but not yet hardened by them into the cruel and calculating man he eventually became. He possessed then a warmth and sensitivity that made him quite different from the other young men of our acquaintance, and I confess that I allowed myself to hope that his interest in me might develop into something deeper than the casual flirtation that characterized most interactions between young people of our class. For 2 seasons we were frequently in each other's company at social gatherings and country house parties, and I believed that I detected in his manner toward me a preference that might have led to a more serious attachment had circumstances been different, and had his family not already begun the process of arranging a marriage that would unite 2 great fortunes and strengthen political alliances that had nothing to do with personal inclination or emotional compatibility. Her voice grew sad as she continued, the firelight playing across features that still bore traces of the beauty that must have captivated the young Duke during those long-ago seasons when the future had seemed full of romantic possibilities. I watched from a distance as he married Helena Fairfax, a distant relation of yours, my dear, though the connection is too remote to be of any practical significance, and I saw how the responsibilities of his position and the influence of advisers who valued power above all other considerations gradually transformed him from the gentle young man I had known into someone whose capacity for cruelty became legendary throughout English society. Most painful of all was observing how his treatment of his wife and son reflected the systematic destruction of everything tender and human within his character. For I knew that somewhere beneath the cold exterior lay the remnant of the man who had once been capable of kindness, and who might have become something quite different had he been allowed to follow the promptings of his heart rather than the demands of duty and ambition. When Sebastian was born, I made myself a silent promise that I would find some way to counteract the damage that I knew his father's influence would inflict upon an innocent child, though the opportunities for such intervention were limited by the constraints of social propriety and the fact that my own circumstances had changed dramatically when I married Mr. Pemberton and found happiness in a union based upon mutual respect and genuine affection rather than the sort of passionate attachment that had once seemed so important to my young heart. Now, seeing Sebastian reduced to such helplessness and vulnerability, I cannot help but feel that Providence has provided me with the chance I never had to show kindness to the Blackwood family, and perhaps to contribute to a healing that might restore to that tortured lineage some measure of the humanity that cruelty and pride have stolen from it over the generations. The legal documents that Rupert Blackwood spread across Lady Pemberton's writing desk bore the impressive seals and formal language that lend gravity to even the most questionable proceedings, their thick parchment rustling with the sort of ominous authority that had intimidated countless individuals into surrendering rights they might otherwise have defended with greater vigor. The hired physician who accompanied Sebastian's cousin was a thin, nervous man whose credentials appeared legitimate enough on paper, but whose willingness to provide whatever diagnosis his employer required spoke to the sort of professional flexibility that thrived in the shadowy margins of medical practice, where ethics could be purchased as easily as opinions, and where the needs of paying clients took precedence over the welfare of patients who could offer no compensation for honest assessments. Dr. Thornfield, as he called himself, had conducted what could charitably be described as a cursory examination of the Duke, spending perhaps 10 minutes in the blue guest chamber before emerging with a solemn expression and a diagnosis that aligned perfectly with Rupert's urgent need to have his cousin declared permanently incapacitated and therefore unsuitable for continued residence in a private home where proper institutional oversight could not be maintained. Lady Pemberton, he announced with the sort of theatrical gravity that inexperienced actors employ when attempting to convey profound medical wisdom, I fear that my examination has confirmed Mr. Blackwood's worst fears regarding his cousin's condition, for the extent of brain damage appears to be far more severe than previous assessments have indicated, and I must strongly recommend immediate transfer to an establishment better equipped to provide the sort of specialized care that such cases require. His words carried the practiced cadence of a man who had delivered similar pronouncements many times before, always with the same outcome and always in service to relatives whose patience for prolonged vigils had reached its natural conclusion in favor of more practical considerations regarding inheritance and the management of family assets that were being wasted on hopeless cases. Rupert nodded with satisfaction at this professional confirmation of his own amateur diagnosis, then fixed Lady Pemberton with the sort of steely gaze that suggested his previous requests had been merely preliminary negotiations, and that the time for gentle persuasion had passed in favor of more direct methods of achieving his objectives. "My dear Lady Pemberton," he began with a tone that managed to be simultaneously respectful and threatening. "While I have the deepest appreciation for the Christian charity you have shown my poor cousin during these trying months, I fear that Dr. Thornfield's assessment makes it clear that continued private care would be both medically inappropriate and financially ruinous for all parties concerned, particularly given the specialized treatments and round-the-clock supervision that his condition now requires. The legal documents before us provide for immediate transfer to the Blackwood family's chosen facility, where Sebastian will receive care from trained professionals who understand how to manage cases of permanent mental incapacity, and I must insist that we proceed with these arrangements without further delay, for any postponement would only serve to worsen his condition while placing an unconscionable burden upon your generous hospitality." The threat underlying his polite words was unmistakable, for the papers he had presented contained not only authorization for Sebastian's removal, but also detailed accounting of the costs associated with his care at Willowbrook Manor, costs that Rupert was now claiming should be borne by Lady Pemberton personally, since the family had never officially authorized such private arrangements and could not be held responsible for expenses incurred without proper legal consent. The implications were clear enough. Surrender Sebastian immediately, or face financial destruction through legal battles that could drag on for years while accumulating costs that would far exceed the modest resources of a widow whose comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle depended upon careful management of a limited income. "I must have your decision today," Rupert continued with the sort of false regret that barely concealed his satisfaction at having cornered his opponent so effectively, for the carriage is waiting outside to transport Sebastian to his new accommodation, and further delay would only complicate matters for everyone involved, while potentially exposing you to additional financial liability that I am certain you would prefer to avoid. Imogen had been listening to this exchange from the doorway of the adjacent room, where she had retreated when Rupert's arrival made it clear that private family matters were about to be discussed. But the barely contained distress in Lady Pemberton's voice and the obvious threat that Rupert's ultimatum represented to Sebastian's welfare compelled her to abandon the discretion that her position normally required in favor of more direct action that might prevent what seemed to be an inevitable catastrophe. The decision to write to Sebastian's London solicitor came to her with the sort of desperate clarity that sometimes emerges in moments of crisis, when conventional solutions have been exhausted and only the most audacious measures offer any hope of success. Though she was fully aware that forging the Duke's signature on legal correspondence represented a criminal act that could result in transportation, or worse, if her deception were discovered by the authorities. Yet as she sat at the small writing desk in her chamber later that evening, practicing Sebastian's distinctive handwriting by copying his signature from the various documents that had arrived during his illness, she found herself thinking not of the personal consequences she might face, but of the man who lay helpless in the room below, dependent upon her courage to protect him from relatives whose only interest in his welfare extended precisely as far as their legal obligations required, and not 1 inch further into the realm of genuine compassion or family loyalty. The letter she finally composed after numerous drafts was a masterpiece of concise urgency, requesting an immediate review of the succession laws governing the Blackwood dukedom and specifically inquiring about the legal procedures required to challenge any attempts to have the current duke declared incompetent without proper medical evidence or adequate time for recovery from his injuries. She included enough specific details about Rupert's activities to make clear that urgent action was required to protect Sebastian's interests, while carefully avoiding any language that might raise questions about how an unconscious man could have acquired such detailed knowledge of his cousin's schemes, or possessed the capacity to compose such a cogent analysis of his legal situation. Most challenging of all was the need to write in Sebastian's voice, adopting the sort of formal yet authoritative tone that would be expected from a man of his education and position, while avoiding any phrases or constructions that might seem inconsistent with his established style of correspondence, a task that required her to draw upon everything she had learned about his character and intellect during their weeks of enforced intimacy. The signature itself proved to be the most nerve-wracking aspect of the entire enterprise, for despite her careful practice, she remained uncertain whether her reproduction of his distinctive handwriting would pass scrutiny from legal professionals who were undoubtedly familiar with authentic examples of the Duke's correspondence. Yet she pressed forward with the sort of determination that comes from knowing that inaction would be far more dangerous than even the most risky attempt at intervention. When the letter was finally complete and sealed with wax that she had carefully melted and impressed with a signet ring she had found among Sebastian's personal effects, Imogen felt a mixture of terror and relief that made her hands shake as she prepared to entrust this dangerous document to the post, knowing that its discovery would mean her complete ruin, while its success might provide Sebastian with the legal protection he desperately needed to survive his cousin's machinations. The irony of her situation was not lost upon her, for in attempting to save the man she had come to love, despite the impossibility of their circumstances, she was committing a crime that would make her forever unsuitable as a companion for someone of his elevated station, even if his recovery eventually made such considerations relevant rather than merely academic exercises in romantic futility. Sebastian's awareness of Imogen's desperate gamble filled him with emotions so complex and overwhelming that they threatened to shatter the careful control he had maintained over his consciousness during these weeks of enforced passivity, for he had observed every detail of her struggle with the letter, from her initial hesitation through her careful practice of his handwriting to the final moment when she sealed the document with trembling hands and whispered a prayer for its safe delivery and favorable reception. The knowledge that this gentle, principled woman was willing to risk everything for his sake, including her reputation, her freedom, and quite possibly her life, struck him with a force that seemed to reverberate through every fiber of his being and awakened feelings that went far beyond the gratitude and affection that had been growing within him since the earliest days of his recovery. Her sacrifice highlighted the impossible position in which his deception had placed them both, for while her belief in his unconscious state had allowed her to open her heart with a freedom that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, it had also made her unknowingly vulnerable to exactly the sort of scandal that could destroy any chance she might have for happiness or security in a society that showed no mercy to women who transgressed its rigid boundaries regarding proper behavior between unmarried persons of different social classes. The intimate conversations they had shared, the personal confessions she had made, believing herself safe from judgment or misunderstanding, the music she had played with such emotional openness, all of these precious moments had been built upon a foundation of trust that would crumble the instant she learned that he had been conscious throughout their entire relationship, listening to every word and cherishing every gesture while maintaining a silence that would appear to her as the cruelest sort of betrayal. Yet continued deception was becoming impossible as well, for her forgery of his signature represented exactly the kind of desperate measure that proved she needed his protection more than his continued passivity, and every day that he delayed revealing his consciousness was another day that she remained exposed to the legal and social consequences of her well-intentioned crime. The dilemma that tormented his thoughts was how to reveal his awareness without destroying the trust that had become more precious to him than his title, his wealth, or any of the other advantages that his position in society provided, for he had come to understand during these weeks of helpless observation that Imogen's love, freely given to a man she believed could never judge or reject her, was worth more than all the calculated deference and strategic flattery that his power had commanded throughout his adult life. The bond between them had developed in a space outside the normal rules of courtship and social interaction, protected by her belief in his incapacity from the sort of self-consciousness and strategic thinking that typically governed relationships between men and women of their respective stations, and he feared that revealing his consciousness would inevitably return them to a world where her modest birth and his elevated rank would make honest communication impossible and genuine affection subordinate to considerations of propriety and social advantage. Most agonizing of all was his growing certainty that she had come to love not the Duke of Ravensholme with all his power and prestige, but the vulnerable man she believed she was nursing back to health, and he could not bear the thought that learning of his deception might cause her to question the authenticity of emotions that had become the foundation of his own transformation from the cold, calculating figure that society knew into someone capable of the sort of tender feeling that he had thought permanently beyond his reach. The irony of his situation was that the very paralysis that had initially seemed like the ultimate nightmare had actually provided him with the greatest gift of his life in the form of Imogen's unguarded love, and now that he was beginning to recover the physical capabilities that would allow him to respond to that love, he faced the terrifying possibility that revealing his recovery might cost him the only thing that had ever made him feel truly alive and worthy of another person's affection. The weight of this knowledge pressed upon him like a physical burden as he lay listening to her gentle movements in the adjacent room, knowing that she was probably staring sleeplessly at the ceiling while worrying about the consequences of her forgery and the uncertainty of whether her desperate gamble would succeed in protecting him from Rupert's schemes. Her willingness to sacrifice herself for his sake had completed the process of emotional awakening that her daily care had begun, transforming him from a man who had never truly understood what it meant to love another person into someone who would gladly surrender everything he possessed to ensure her happiness and security. Yet the very depth of his feelings made the prospect of confession even more terrifying, for he could not bear to imagine the look of betrayal and disgust that would surely cross her features when she realized how thoroughly she had been deceived. The knowledge that he had been conscious during her most vulnerable moments, that he had witnessed her tears and heard her private fears while maintaining the pretense of unconsciousness, would strike her as a violation of trust so profound that no explanation or declaration of love could possibly excuse it, and he found himself caught between the competing demands of protecting her from the consequences of her forgery and protecting their relationship from the revelation that would surely destroy it. As he lay in the darkness listening to the winter wind howl across the moors outside his window, Sebastian realized that his recovery had become secondary to the more complex challenge of finding a way to claim the love he had discovered while preserving the trust upon which it was built, a task that seemed to require a wisdom and delicacy that his previous life had never demanded, and for which all his experience in negotiation and strategy had left him woefully unprepared. The eve of Christmas at Willowbrook Manor arrived with a gentle snowfall that transformed the familiar landscape into something ethereal and magical, as though the very earth had donned its finest garments to celebrate the season of hope and renewal that had come to mean so much more to Imogen than mere religious observance during these weeks of caring for a man whose presence had transformed her understanding of what it meant to truly love another human being. Lady Pemberton had retired early after their modest Christmas Eve dinner, claiming fatigue but actually recognizing with the sort of delicate intuition that comes from a lifetime of observing human nature that her companion needed solitude to process the complex emotions that had been building throughout the day as the weight of her forgery and its potential consequences pressed upon her consciousness like a physical burden that grew heavier with each passing hour. The blue guest chamber glowed with the warm light of candles that Imogen had lit, despite the lateness of the hour, for she found herself reluctant to embrace the darkness that would mark the end of what might prove to be their last Christmas together, if Rupert's threats materialized into action, or if her desperate gamble with the forged letter brought consequences that would remove her from Sebastian's side forever. She sat in her customary chair beside his bed, her hands folded in her lap as she studied his peaceful features in the flickering candlelight, searching for signs of the subtle changes that had become more pronounced in recent days, but which she dared not hope indicated anything more than her imagination creating evidence where none existed. Born from the desperate wish that somehow her music and her care might be reaching him in ways that conventional medical wisdom could not explain or predict. The silence that surrounded them felt different tonight, charged with an intimacy that had been building slowly over these weeks of shared solitude, but which now seemed to demand expression before the opportunity might be lost forever to the uncertain future that awaited them both. "Your Grace?" she began softly, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire that warmed the room against the December chill that pressed against the windows like a living thing seeking entry into their sanctuary. "I find myself compelled to speak tonight of matters that proper decorum would normally forbid me to discuss. Yet the season and our peculiar circumstances seem to grant permission for confessions that might otherwise remain locked forever within the chambers of the heart, where society insists such dangerous feelings must be contained." She paused, gathering courage for words that once spoken could never be recalled, words that would either damn her as a foolish woman who had mistaken gratitude and proximity for something deeper and more meaningful, or reveal truths that her heart had been whispering with increasing insistence during these long weeks of intimate companionship. "I fear that I have committed the gravest breach of propriety that a woman in my position could possibly imagine, for I have allowed myself to develop feelings for you that extend far beyond the professional concern that should characterize the relationship between a patient and his caregiver. Feelings that would be inappropriate under any circumstances, but which become almost scandalous when one considers the vast difference in our stations and the fact that you have never had the opportunity to encourage or discourage such sentiments through word or gesture." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, as though the act of confession itself was providing her with courage she had not known she possessed, and she found herself speaking with the sort of honesty that can only emerge when one believes the listener incapable of judgment or rejection. "I have fallen in love with you, Sebastian." though I know it is presumptuous of me to use your Christian name, and even more presumptuous to imagine that my feelings could ever be of interest to a man of your elevated position and distinguished accomplishments. Yet I cannot help but speak the truth that has been growing within my heart since those first days when I began to understand that beneath the reputation for coldness and calculation that preceded you into this house lay a man capable of depths of feeling and nobility of spirit that society has never been permitted to witness. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his still features as she struggled to find words adequate to express emotions that seemed too large and complex for the limited vocabulary that her modest education had provided. Yet she pressed forward with the determination of someone who might never again have the opportunity to speak such truths aloud. "It is not the Duke of Ravensholme that has captured my affections, Your Grace, though I have the deepest respect for the position you hold and the responsibilities that must weigh so heavily upon your shoulders, but rather the man I have glimpsed in unguarded moments when sleep has softened the harsh lines that life has etched upon your features, and allowed me to see what you might have been if circumstances had been kinder to the boy you once were before the world taught you to armor your heart against its casual cruelties. In those peaceful moments when your face loses the stern expression that keeps others at a respectful distance, I have imagined the gentleman who might emerge if he were shown the sort of unconditional acceptance and tender care that every human soul deserves, but which I suspect has been too rarely offered to someone whose power makes others approach him with calculated motives rather than genuine affection." The confession that followed seemed to pour from her heart with such natural eloquence that Sebastian, listening with every fibre of his being focused upon her words, felt as though he were witnessing the birth of something beautiful and terrible, a declaration of love so pure and selfless that it seemed to illuminate all the dark corners of his existence, while simultaneously highlighting the magnitude of the deception he had perpetrated against the very person who had become more precious to him than life itself. "If Providence should grant you recovery," she continued, her voice taking on the quality of a sacred vow spoken before invisible witnesses, "I pledge to you my solemn promise that I shall dedicate whatever remains of my life to showing you the kindness and understanding that have been denied to you for too long, asking nothing in return except the privilege of remaining in your presence and perhaps helping to heal the wounds that isolation and mistrust have inflicted upon a heart that I believe was created for far greater tenderness than this harsh world has allowed it to express. I know that such devotion from one so humble as myself can offer little consolation to a man accustomed to the deference of peers and the calculated attention of those who seek his favor. Yet I pray that you might find some comfort in knowing that there exists at least one person who has seen past the barriers that necessity has taught you to maintain, and who loves not your title or your wealth or your power over others, but simply the essential truth of who you are beneath all the protective layers that life has required you to construct." Her words carried the weight of absolute sincerity, unmarred by any trace of the strategic thinking that Sebastian had come to expect from those who sought his attention or favor, and he found himself overwhelmed by the realization that she loved him not despite his vulnerability, but because it had allowed her to see the man he might have been if his father's systematic destruction of his capacity for trust had not forced him to become someone capable of surviving in a world where weakness was inevitably exploited and tenderness was invariably punished. "I have watched you during these weeks of silence," she whispered, her voice growing softer as though she were sharing the most intimate of secrets. "And I have seen moments when your breathing changes in response to music, or when your features seem to react to words of comfort. And though Dr. Whitmore assures me that such responses are merely involuntary reactions without conscious meaning, I choose to believe that somewhere within your stillness lives a soul that yearns for connection with another human being who might understand and value the precious gift of your authentic self. Whether you can hear these words or not, I want you to know that your presence in my life has transformed my understanding of what love truly means. For it is not the passionate romance that poets celebrate in their verses, but rather the deep recognition of another person's essential worth, and the desire to nurture their happiness even at the cost of one's own comfort or security. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand upon his, the first time she had dared such intimacy, despite their weeks of shared solitude. And Sebastian felt the warmth of her touch penetrate not only his skin, but his very soul, as she continued her declaration with words that seemed to brand themselves upon his consciousness with their beauty and sincerity. If you should die without ever knowing that you were loved completely, and without reservation by someone who asked nothing of you except the gift of your existence, then I shall carry the burden of that lost opportunity for the remainder of my days, reproaching myself for lacking the courage to speak sooner of feelings that proper society would condemn, but which my heart recognizes as the most sacred truth it has ever known. Yet if by some miracle you should recover and return to the world that awaits your leadership and wisdom, I pray that you might carry with you the knowledge that during your darkest hour there was someone who saw in your helplessness not weakness, but the precious vulnerability that makes us human. Someone who would gladly spend her life protecting that vulnerability from a world that has no patience for the tender emotions that give existence its deepest meaning and most lasting joy. The physical response that Imogen's Christmas Eve confession triggered within Sebastian's previously unresponsive body was like the breaking of a dam that had held back the accumulated force of weeks spent in enforced stillness. As though the sheer emotional intensity of her declaration had somehow provided the catalyst his nervous system needed to complete the healing process that had been progressing in microscopic increments since those first days when her voice had become his only anchor to sanity and hope. The connection between his consciousness and his motor functions, which had been rebuilding itself through pathways that medical science barely understood, suddenly crystallized into something approaching normal responsiveness, and for the first time since the accident, he felt genuine sensation returning to his extremities with a vividness that was almost overwhelming after so many weeks of existing purely within the confines of his own thoughts. Yet even as his body prepared to rejoin the world of the living, his mind remained trapped in the terrible dilemma that had been tormenting him for days, torn between the desperate need to respond to her love with the honesty she deserved and the paralyzing fear that revelation of his deception would destroy the very thing he most cherished about their relationship. The moment when his eyes finally opened, responding to a combination of conscious will and involuntary neural firing, coincided perfectly with the final notes of the lullaby she had been humming while she held his hand, and the sight of her face illuminated by candlelight and transformed by an expression of joy so radiant that it seemed to make the entire room glow with ethereal beauty, struck him with such force that he nearly forgot the careful plan he had devised for managing his apparent recovery. Imogen's gasp of wonder and delight as she saw his eyes focus upon her features filled the quiet chamber with a sound that was part prayer and part celebration, yet her immediate transition from joy to concern as she noticed his apparent confusion and disorientation reminded him that he was now committed to perhaps the most challenging performance of his life, one that would require him to convincingly portray a man slowly recovering consciousness and memory while actually possessing complete awareness of everything that had transpired during his supposed unconsciousness. "My lord," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion as she leaned closer to study his features for signs of recognition or understanding. "Can you hear me? Can you see me? Do you know where you are?" Her questions carried the sort of gentle urgency that medical professionals might use with a patient whose mental state remained uncertain, yet Sebastian detected beneath her clinical concern the deeper note of personal anxiety that spoke to how much his recovery meant to her on a level that transcended professional duty or charitable obligation. He allowed his gaze to wander around the unfamiliar room with the sort of puzzled expression that might be expected from someone awakening to find himself in strange surroundings with no clear memory of how he had arrived there, then returned his attention to her face with what he hoped appeared to be growing recognition, mixed with continued confusion about the circumstances that had brought them together. "Where?" he managed to whisper, his voice genuinely hoarse from weeks of disuse, but his disorientation carefully manufactured to conceal the fact that he knew perfectly well not only where he was, but every detail of how he had come to be there. "Am I? Who are you? What has happened to me?" The questions came out as separate fragments, as though his mind were struggling to form coherent thoughts, and he was gratified to see that his performance was convincing enough to trigger her immediate shift into the sort of gentle, patient mode that had characterized her care throughout his recovery. "You are safe, my lord," she assured him with the sort of calm authority that he had come to associate with her most tender moments of caregiving. "You are at Willowbrook Manor, the home of Lady Pemberton, and you have been recovering from injuries sustained in a carriage accident some weeks ago. I am Miss Fairfax, your caregiver, and you need not worry about anything except resting and allowing your strength to return gradually." Her explanation was delivered with the kind of professional composure that managed to mask the personal turmoil he knew she must be experiencing as she witnessed his apparent awakening. Yet he could detect in her voice the underlying current of joy that his recovery represented, mixed with anxiety about the extent of his memory loss and cognitive function. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable, for here she was explaining to him circumstances that he understood far better than she did, while he was forced to maintain the pretense of confusion and gradual recollection in order to avoid confronting her with the devastating knowledge of how completely he had deceived her during what she believed had been her most private and vulnerable moments. "Dr. Whitmore must be summoned immediately," she continued, more to herself than to him, as she moved with efficient purpose to ring the bell that would summon the household staff, "for he will want to examine you and assess the extent of your recovery, though I must warn you that your memories may return only gradually, and some may never come back at all, which is perfectly normal in cases such as yours, where the brain has suffered significant trauma." Sebastian watched her efficient movements with a mixture of admiration for her competence and anguish at the necessity of continuing to deceive someone who deserved nothing but complete honesty from the man she had just declared herself willing to love without reservation. Yet he could see no alternative that would not result in the immediate destruction of everything beautiful that had developed between them during these weeks of enforced intimacy. The performance he was now committed to maintaining would require him to rediscover gradually not only his own identity and history, but also the depth of feeling that had developed between them, pretending to fall in love with her anew while actually cherishing every moment of their previous relationship, and desperately hoping that somehow he might find a way to preserve the trust that was the foundation of everything meaningful in his existence. As she bustled about the room preparing for the doctor's arrival and whispering prayers of thanksgiving for his recovery, Sebastian closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for what would surely be the most difficult deception of his life, one that would require him to appear to become the man he had already learned to be, while concealing the fact that her love had already transformed him into someone worthy of the devotion she had so courageously declared during those precious moments when she believed herself safe from observation or judgment. The arrival of Mr. James Pemberton at Willowbrook Manor on the morning of December 27th brought with it an air of purposeful energy that seemed to dispel the peaceful atmosphere that had characterized the household during Sebastian's recovery, as the distinguished London solicitor swept into the estate with the sort of brisk efficiency that marked men accustomed to dealing with complex legal matters that required immediate attention and decisive action. Lady Pemberton's nephew possessed the same keen intelligence and uncompromising integrity that had made his aunt such a formidable presence in local society, though his professional demeanour carried an additional weight of authority that came from years of representing some of England's most powerful families in matters where fortunes and reputations hung in the balance with each carefully crafted document and strategic manoeuvre. His examination of the forged letter had been thorough, but yielded no obvious signs of deception to his practiced eye, for Imogen's careful study of Sebastian's handwriting had produced a reproduction skillful enough to pass casual inspection, though Mr. Pemberton's trained instincts detected something indefinably different about the communication that prompted him to conduct the sort of detailed investigation that might reveal irregularities in timing or content that could indicate fraud or coercion. However, what his inquiries actually uncovered proved far more shocking than any questions about the letter's authenticity, for his examination of the estate's financial records during the period of Sebastian's incapacity had revealed a pattern of unauthorized transactions and questionable expenditures that pointed to systematic embezzlement by someone with access to ducal accounts and the authority to conduct business in Sebastian's name. The evidence was damning in its clarity, showing how Rupert had used his position as heir apparent to convince various financial institutions and business associates that he possessed temporary authority to manage estate affairs during his cousin's illness, then proceeded to redirect funds into personal accounts and investments that bore no relation to legitimate ducal business or the proper management of Blackwood properties throughout England. Mr. Pemberton's discovery of these irregularities filled him with the sort of righteous anger that honest men feel when confronted with deliberate betrayal of trust, particularly when such betrayal involved the exploitation of a helpless family member whose incapacity made him vulnerable to exactly the sort of predatory behavior that Rupert had exhibited with such brazen confidence. Armed with documentary evidence that would ensure Rupert's immediate prosecution and probable transportation if the matter were brought before the courts, the solicitor requested a private meeting with Lady Pemberton and Miss Fairfax to discuss the legal ramifications of his discoveries and to plan a strategy for protecting Sebastian's interests while ensuring that his cousin faced appropriate consequences for crimes that had been perpetrated under cover of familial concern and medical necessity. The confrontation that followed when Mr. Pemberton presented his findings to Rupert in the presence of witnesses revealed the true nature of a man whose carefully maintained facade of aristocratic propriety crumbled instantly when faced with irrefutable proof of his criminal activities, transforming him from the grieving relative concerned only with his cousin's welfare into something approaching a cornered animal whose desperation made him capable of threats and behaviors that shocked even those who had suspected his motives from the beginning. "My dear Mr. Pemberton," Rupert began with forced calm that fooled no one present as he attempted to maintain his dignity, while the walls of his carefully constructed deception collapsed around him. "I fear there may be some misunderstanding about the financial arrangements I made on Sebastian's behalf, for everything I did was motivated by concern for the proper management of estate affairs during a crisis that threatened to leave important business matters unattended while he remained unable to fulfill his ducal responsibilities." The explanation that followed was a masterpiece of calculated misdirection and outright fabrication, as Rupert attempted to portray his embezzlement as prudent financial management and his unauthorized access to Sebastian's accounts as necessary emergency measures taken to prevent greater losses that might have resulted from administrative neglect. Yet the documentary evidence that Mr. Pemberton spread across the table made such claims appear not merely implausible, but actively insulting to the intelligence of everyone present. When it became clear that his financial crimes had been discovered, and that legal prosecution was inevitable unless he could find some alternative leverage to protect himself from the consequences of his actions, Rupert's desperation led him to make the sort of tactical error that often characterizes the behavior of criminals who have exhausted their conventional options and must resort to increasingly dangerous gambles in their attempts to avoid justice. His attention turned to Imogen with the sort of calculating assessment that made her skin crawl as she realized that he was evaluating her potential usefulness as either an ally who might be persuaded to support his version of events, or a victim whose vulnerability could be exploited to create the sort of scandal that might deflect attention from his own crimes. "Miss Fairfax," he said with a tone that managed to be simultaneously threatening and ingratiating, "I believe you and I have matters to discuss that might prove mutually beneficial, for I have reason to believe that your devotion to my cousin's welfare may have led you to take certain liberties with his correspondence that could place you in a most precarious legal position if brought to the attention of the proper authorities." The implication was clear enough to make Lady Pemberton gasp with indignation, while Mr. Pemberton's expression darkened with the sort of professional anger that honest solicitors reserve for those who attempt to pervert the legal system through blackmail and intimidation. Yet Imogen herself remained remarkably composed as she faced this new threat, with the same courage that had enabled her to forge Sebastian's signature in her original attempt to protect him from his cousin's schemes. "I am not certain what you mean to suggest, Mr. Blackwood," she replied with a dignity that impressed everyone present, "but I can assure you that any actions I may have taken on His Grace's behalf were motivated by concern for his welfare and nothing more, and I am perfectly willing to account for my behavior to any authority that might require such an accounting." Her refusal to be intimidated seemed to infuriate Rupert beyond the bounds of rational behavior, prompting him to abandon all pretense of civilized discourse in favor of threats that revealed the true depths of his moral corruption and his willingness to destroy an innocent woman in his desperate attempts to avoid the consequences of his crimes. "Perhaps you would be more willing to reconsider your position," he snarled with barely controlled rage, "if you understood that exposure of your little forgery would not only result in your transportation to the colonies, but would also destroy Lady Pemberton's reputation for harboring a criminal in her household, to say nothing of the scandal that would attach to any family foolish enough to employ you in the future." The cruelty of these words, designed to exploit Imogen's loyalty to her employer and her anxiety about her future security, struck Sebastian with such force that his carefully maintained pretense of weakness and confusion nearly shattered under the pressure of protective rage that demanded immediate action to defend the woman who had sacrificed everything for his sake. However, it was Rupert's next words that finally proved too much for Sebastian's self-control to withstand. As his cousin's desperation led him to make the sort of proposal that no gentleman could hear directed toward a lady under his protection without responding with immediate and decisive force. "Of course, dear Miss Fairfax, there might be alternative arrangements that could prove satisfactory to all parties concerned, for I am not without influence in certain circles, and a young woman of your obvious charms might find that discretion regarding past irregularities could be purchased through a willingness to provide companionship of a more intimate nature than your current position requires, arrangements that need not involve the sort of legal complications that might otherwise prove so troublesome for everyone involved." The response that erupted from Sebastian at these words carried such authority and barely controlled violence that everyone present turned to stare at him in shock, for the voice that emerged from his supposedly weakened form was unmistakably that of the Duke of Ravensholme, in full command of his faculties and his fury, with no trace of the confusion or disorientation that had characterized his previous utterances since his apparent awakening. "You will leave this house immediately, Rupert," Sebastian declared, as he struggled to sit up in bed, with movements that suggested far greater strength than anyone had believed him to possess. "And if you ever dare to speak to Miss Fairfax in such terms again, I will personally ensure that your prosecution includes charges of attempted extortion and sexual coercion that will guarantee your transportation to the furthest reaches of the empire, where your family name will provide no protection from the sort of justice that awaits men who prey upon virtuous women." The transformation was so complete and so sudden that even Mr. Pemberton, who had seen many surprising reversals in his legal career, found himself temporarily speechless as he watched a man who had appeared barely conscious only moments before assume the full dignity and commanding presence that had made him one of England's most feared and respected peers. Sebastian's knowledge of the financial details surrounding Rupert's embezzlement, his understanding of the legal implications of various courses of action, and his obvious awareness of conversations and developments that should have been completely unknown to someone in his supposed condition, made it clear to everyone present that his recovery had been far more complete than anyone had realized, and that his apparent confusion had been either a natural consequence of gradual healing or a deliberate performance designed to conceal the true extent of his awareness. The silence that followed his unexpected display of authority was broken only by Rupert's hasty retreat from the room, his face pale with the realization that his schemes had not only failed, but had been observed and understood by the very man he had been attempting to rob, while Mr. Pemberton began to reassess the entire situation in light of this dramatic revelation about his client's true conditions. Yet it was Imogen's reaction that concerned Sebastian most, for her face had gone white with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension that made him realize she was beginning to understand the full implications of what she had just witnessed, including the disturbing possibility that his apparent helplessness had been at least partially feigned, and that her most private confessions might have been heard and understood by someone who was far more aware of his surroundings than she had ever imagined possible. The confrontation that Imogen initiated later that evening, after the household had settled into an uneasy quiet following the day's dramatic revelations, and Mr. Pemberton had departed with promises to begin immediate legal proceedings against Rupert, took place in the blue guest chamber that had witnessed so many intimate conversations during the weeks of Sebastian's supposed unconsciousness. Her manner as she entered the room was markedly different from the gentle solicitude that had characterized her previous visits, replaced by a determined composure that suggested she had spent the intervening hours piecing together inconsistencies in his behavior that now demanded explanation and acknowledgement. "Your Grace," she began with a formality that struck him like a physical blow after weeks of the warm familiarity that had developed between them, "I find myself compelled to ask you several questions about your recovery and the extent of your awareness during the period when we all believed you to be unconscious, for certain aspects of today's events have raised concerns about the accuracy of our understanding regarding your condition." Her voice carried the sort of controlled emotion that suggested she was struggling to maintain professional detachment while dealing with personal feelings that had been profoundly disturbed by the possibility that their entire relationship had been built upon deception rather than the honest intimacy she had believed they shared. "The knowledge you displayed today about family financial matters and legal procedures suggests a level of awareness that would be inconsistent with the gradual recovery that Dr. Whitmore described as typical for cases such as yours, and I cannot help but wonder whether your apparent confusion and memory loss might have been less complete than your behavior indicated." Sebastian felt his carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the steady pressure of her questions, for he had always known that Imogen possessed the sort of intelligence and observational skills that would eventually detect the inconsistencies in his performance, yet he had hoped for more time to find a way to reveal his deception without destroying the trust that had become more precious to him than life itself. "Miss Fairfax," he began with an attempt at the sort of authoritative dismissal that had always served him well in business negotiations, where uncomfortable questions threatened to expose strategic weaknesses, I fear you may be reading too much significance into what was merely the natural result of memory returning in fragments that sometimes included information I was not consciously aware of retaining. Yet even as he spoke these words, he could see that they carried no conviction, and that her penetrating gaze was stripping away the last pretenses that had allowed him to maintain his deception through weeks of intimate conversations that now seemed poisoned by the dishonesty that had made them possible. The questions that followed revealed the depth of her analytical thinking and her willingness to pursue truth, regardless of how painful the revelations might prove to be for both of them, as she methodically outlined the evidence that had led her to suspect that his recovery had been far more advanced than anyone realized, and that his apparent helplessness had been at least partially performed rather than genuine. You knew about Rupert's schemes in detail that could only have been acquired through conscious observation of his visits and conversations. She continued, with relentless logic that made evasion impossible. You responded to my Christmas Eve confession in ways that suggested emotional understanding rather than mere involuntary physical reactions, and your display of authority this afternoon required not only complete mental clarity, but detailed knowledge of legal and financial matters that an unconscious man could not have possessed. The accuracy of her deductions filled Sebastian with a mixture of admiration for her intelligence and despair at the realization that the moment of truth he had been dreading was finally upon them, leaving him with no choice but to confess the deception that had allowed him to experience her love while simultaneously making him unworthy of it through the betrayal of trust that such deception represented. The confession that Sebastian finally made that evening carried with it the weight of weeks spent wrestling with an impossible dilemma that had no solution capable of preserving both his love for Imogen and the trust upon which that love had been built. Yet as he faced her steady gaze and saw the pain and bewilderment in her eyes, he knew that continued deception would be far more cruel than the truth, however devastating its immediate consequences might prove to be. "Miss Fairfax," he began with a voice that trembled despite his efforts to maintain the composure that had served him so well in countless business negotiations and social encounters. "You are correct in your suspicions about my condition, for I have been conscious and aware far longer than anyone realized, trapped not by physical incapacity, but by circumstances that made revelation seem impossible without destroying the most precious thing that has ever entered my life." The words felt like physical objects torn from his chest, each one carrying the potential to shatter the fragile bond between them, while simultaneously offering the only hope for something genuine to emerge from the wreckage of his deception. "I regained consciousness 3 days after my arrival at Willowbrook Manor," he continued, forcing himself to meet her eyes despite the temptation to look away from the growing comprehension and hurt that he saw reflected there. "Yet when I attempted to respond to your care, I discovered that my body remained unresponsive to my will, creating a prison of flesh that left me aware but unable to communicate my awareness to anyone around me. The paralysis was temporary, as you have witnessed, but during those early days I had no way of knowing that recovery was possible, and my initial reaction was one of such fury at my helplessness that I believe I would have dismissed everyone involved in my care the moment I regained the ability to speak, viewing your kindness as pity and your attention as the sort of professional obligation that I had always despised when offered by those who saw me only as a source of employment rather than as a human being deserving of genuine concern." Her expression had not changed as he spoke, maintaining the sort of controlled attention that suggested she was determined to hear his complete explanation before allowing herself to react emotionally to revelations that must be striking her with the force of betrayal and humiliation. Yet he could see in the set of her shoulders and the careful stillness of her hands that she was struggling to contain feelings that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational analysis. "It was your voice that saved me from that initial rage," he admitted, his own voice growing softer as he remembered those first days when her reading had been his only connection to sanity and hope. "For there was something in the way you spoke to me, not as a duke or a patient, but simply as another human being who deserved consideration and respect, that began to work changes within me that I had thought impossible after years of believing that emotional connection was a luxury I could not afford if I hoped to survive in a world that showed no mercy to those who revealed vulnerability or need. Day after day, I listened to you read and sing and share stories that revealed depths of character and reserves of compassion that I had never encountered before, even among those who professed friendship or love for strategic reasons of their own. And gradually, I began to understand that your care for me was motivated by something far more rare and precious than duty or professional obligation. The realization that someone could tend to another person's needs without calculation or expectation of reward was so foreign to my experience that it took weeks for me to accept that such selfless devotion actually existed. Yet as I observed your consistent kindness and witnessed your genuine distress when my condition showed no improvement, I began to hope that perhaps the world contained more goodness than my cynical education had led me to believe. The transformation that your stories and music worked within me was unlike anything I had ever experienced," Sebastian continued, his voice taking on a quality of wonder that made it clear he was still amazed by the changes that had occurred during those weeks of enforced passivity. "For you taught me through your own example what it meant to care for another person without expecting anything in return, and your descriptions of sacrifice made for love rather than gain showed me possibilities for human connection that I had dismissed as romantic fantasy, designed to comfort those too weak to face the harsh realities of existence. When you spoke of your father's devotion to music and your willingness to surrender your own dreams for your sister's security, I began to understand that my own experiences of betrayal and exploitation were not universal truths about human nature, but rather the unfortunate consequences of moving in circles where power and wealth attracted only those whose motives were corrupted by greed and ambition rather than guided by genuine affection or loyalty. Your daily presence became the center of my existence during those weeks when I had nothing else to occupy my thoughts, except the sound of your voice, and the gentle competence with which you performed tasks that others might have considered menial, but which you approached with the same care you might have shown to the most honored guest in your own home. The melodies you hummed while arranging flowers or straightening my chamber were more beautiful than any performance I had ever heard in the finest concert halls of London, not because of their technical perfection, but because they sprang from a spirit that found joy in small acts of service and beauty in moments that most people would consider ordinary or unremarkable. Most profoundly moving of all was your willingness to share your own compositions with someone you believed could never judge or criticize your efforts, for those pieces revealed an artistic gift that rivaled anything I had heard from celebrated musicians, yet more importantly, they showed me a soul capable of creating beauty from experiences of loss and disappointment rather than allowing such trials to embitter or diminish your capacity for hope and wonder. The lullaby that reminded me of my mother's singing was like a key that unlocked memories and emotions I had buried so deeply that I had convinced myself they no longer existed, and hearing you play melodies that echoed the only source of tenderness in my childhood made me realize that the capacity for love had not been entirely destroyed by years of careful emotional suppression, though it had taken your influence to awaken feelings that my father's harsh education had taught me to consider dangerous weaknesses that would only invite exploitation by those who recognized and targeted such vulnerabilities. As the days passed, and I began to understand the true extent of your sacrificial nature. Watching you forge documents that could result in your transportation, or worse, simply to protect someone you believed incapable of gratitude or recognition, I found myself experiencing emotions that I had thought permanently beyond my reach. Chief among them, a desperate desire to be worthy of the love you were showing to a man who had never inspired such devotion through his own actions or character. The knowledge that you cared for me not because of my title or wealth, but in spite of them, seeing in my helpless condition an opportunity to show mercy rather than a burden to be endured, convinced me that perhaps redemption was possible, even for someone whose reputation for coldness had been earned through years of ruthless behavior, designed to protect himself from the sort of pain that my father's cruelty had inflicted during my formative years. Your Christmas Eve confession was simultaneously the most wonderful and the most torturous experience of my life, Sebastian admitted, with a voice that carried such raw emotion that Imogen found herself leaning forward despite her anger and hurt, drawn by the obvious sincerity of his words, even as her rational mind insisted that his deception made any declaration from him suspect and unreliable. To hear you speak of love with such purity and selflessness, offering your devotion without any expectation that it would be returned or even acknowledged, was like being offered a glimpse of paradise from the depths of hell, for I knew that I was receiving the most precious gift that one human being can offer another, while simultaneously being aware that my acceptance of it was founded upon a deception that would make me forever unworthy of such trust and affection. Every word you spoke that night seemed to burn itself into my consciousness with an intensity that made it impossible to forget even the smallest detail of your declaration. Yet each expression of love also reminded me of the growing chasm between the truth of my awareness and the innocence of your confession. For you were offering your heart to someone you believed incapable of betraying that trust through conscious choice or deliberate deception. The irony of my situation was almost unbearable, for your love had transformed me into someone capable of deserving such devotion, while the very deception that had allowed me to receive it made me unworthy of the woman who had created this transformation through her gentle influence and unwavering faith in the possibility of human goodness. I lay there listening to your beautiful words, and feeling my heart break with the knowledge that revealing my consciousness would inevitably destroy the intimacy that had made such honesty possible. For once you learned that I had been aware during your most vulnerable moments, the sanctuary of trust that had allowed you to speak freely would be forever contaminated by the knowledge that your private privacy had been violated and your confidences overheard by someone who had chosen to maintain a silence that now seemed like the cruelest sort of voyeurism. Yet continuing the deception also became impossible as I watched you sacrifice yourself for my sake, committing crimes that could destroy your future simply because you believed I needed protection and had no one else willing to fight for my interests against relatives whose greed outweighed any family loyalty they might once have possessed. The sight of you risking everything for someone you thought could never thank or acknowledge your efforts filled me with such overwhelming love and gratitude that maintaining my silence seemed like a betrayal of everything you had given me. Yet breaking that silence promised to shatter the very foundation upon which our relationship had been built, and perhaps destroy forever any chance we might have for a future based on mutual understanding rather than one-sided devotion. When Rupert made his obscene proposals today, my protective instincts overrode every other consideration, for I could not bear to see you threatened by someone whose moral corruption had already been demonstrated through his financial crimes and whose willingness to exploit your vulnerability represented exactly the sort of predatory behavior that my position should have protected you from experiencing. In that moment, preserving my deception seemed far less important than ensuring your safety. even if revelation of my true condition meant losing the only source of happiness I had ever known in exchange for the satisfaction of seeing you defended from insult and protected from harm." The long silence that followed Sebastian's confession stretched between them like a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing moment. Filled with the weight of revelations that had fundamentally altered the nature of their relationship and left both of them struggling to understand what, if anything, could be salvaged from the wreckage of the intimacy they had shared during those weeks when she believed him unconscious and vulnerable while he was actually aware and capable of responding to her care with the sort of grateful love that he had never thought himself capable of experiencing. Imogen's face had gone through a series of expressions during his explanation, from hurt and anger to gradual comprehension, and finally to a sort of thoughtful sadness that suggested she was beginning to understand the impossible position in which his initial paralysis and subsequent recovery had placed them both. Though he could see that the knowledge of his deception had wounded her in ways that might prove impossible to heal, regardless of his motives, or the genuine transformation that her influence had worked within his character. "Your Grace," she finally said, her voice carefully controlled, but carrying undertones of pain that made him wince with the knowledge that he had caused such suffering to the person whose happiness had become more important to him than his own survival. "I can see that your situation was indeed impossible, and I am beginning to understand that your deception was motivated by love rather than malice. Yet I cannot ignore the fact that our entire relationship has been built upon my belief in your incapacity to judge or reject the confessions I made in what I thought was complete privacy." The words she had shared during those quiet hours now seemed tainted by the knowledge that they had been heard and evaluated by someone whose consciousness she had never suspected, and the intimacy that had once felt like a precious gift now carried the sting of violation and the humiliation that comes from realizing that one's most vulnerable moments have been witnessed by someone who chose to remain silent rather than acknowledge their awareness and allow natural boundaries to be established between them. "I understand why you felt trapped by circumstances beyond your control," she continued, with the sort of careful fairness that reflected her generous nature even in the midst of her own pain and confusion. "And I can even appreciate that revealing your consciousness might have ended our relationship before it had the chance to develop into something meaningful. Yet I cannot help but feel that every moment of closeness we shared was founded upon a false premise that makes it impossible for me to trust my own judgment about the nature of your character or the authenticity of the feelings that seemed to develop between us during those weeks of intimate conversation." The realization that he had been consciously present during her Christmas Eve declaration of love filled her with a mixture of shame and anger that was almost overwhelming. For those words had been spoken with the sort of complete vulnerability that was only possible when one believed oneself safe from judgment or rejection, and the knowledge that they had been heard by someone who was capable of responding but chose not to made her feel as though her most sacred emotions had been somehow cheapened by the deception that had surrounded their expression. Yet even as these feelings of betrayal and humiliation threatened to consume her capacity for rational thought, another part of her mind was beginning to recognize that the man who had listened to her confessions with such obvious emotion was indeed the same person who had inspired her to commit forgery in his defense, and that the transformation he claimed to have experienced during their time together was evident in his willingness to defend her against Rupert's threats, even at the cost of revealing his deception and facing the consequences of his prolonged silence.